It was 2 in the morning in the heart of the city. The streets slept under a blanket of silence, the lamps on the avenues glowing faintly like tired watchmen. Most windows were dark, but the tall glass tower of Helios Labs pierced the night sky like a crystal blade. Floor after floor lay unlit, except for one, the 20th. Its light burned steadily, a rectangle of gold against the black sky, a sign that something restless was alive within. A boy stood at the entrance. His name was Ethan Ward. He was 12 years old, son of a night shift newspaper carrier, and he carried a canvas bag heavy with folded papers. The bag weighed against his thin shoulders, and his jacket, worn and frayed at the seams, offered little defense against the chill of the night. He should have gone straight inside, placed the stack in the lobby box, and left. But his eyes caught something through the glass doors, something unusual. A conference room left unguarded, blinds half open, a whiteboard filled with rows of numbers and letters. Across the top in red marker was written a phrase both mysterious and enormous. Final optimization model, 800 million acquisition. Ethan's steps faltered, his eyes locked on the board. For a moment he forgot the weight of the bag, forgot the cold, forgot even where he stood. The equations spread across the whiteboard like a river of symbols, matrices lined in brackets, variables marked by X and Y, arrows indicating constraints. And there, buried in the middle of the lattice, was the mistake. A single sign reversed, a plus where there should have been a minus. To an ordinary onlooker, it was invisible. But to Ethan, it was a fracture in the bone of the whole structure. He felt a sharp intake of breath. He had seen this before, not in a classroom. No one at his school had ever spoken of such things, but in old textbooks scavenged from thrift stores, in scanned lectures watched secretly on a borrowed laptop, in fragments of discussions between graduate students on online forums. This was the shadow of an NP hard optimization problem, a problem so complex that no efficient solution was known. What he saw on the board was someone's attempt to tame it, to polish it into a formula that looked reliable. But with the sign reversed in the constraint matrix, the entire model would give answers that looked perfect, while in reality, they were impossible. It was a deception built of symbols, as fragile as glass. Ethan pressed his hand against the glass of the lobby. He whispered into the emptiness, "They do not see it. They do not know." The night gave no reply. The light on the 20th floor glowed on, oblivious, and Ethan Ward, son of a paper carrier, stood alone with the knowledge that a mistake worth $800 million had revealed itself to him and him alone. His father's voice called him back. John Ward, his shoulders stooped from years of lifting bundles, stood by the cart. "Ethan," he said, his voice roughened by the cold, "we need to finish the East Block before dawn." Ethan blinked, torn away from the equations. The weight of the bag returned to his shoulder. He looked one last time at the board, at the secret blazing in red, then turned and followed his father into the night. For 3 years he had followed this routine. At 11:30 they arrived at the warehouse, where the air smelled of ink and damp paper. Stacks of fresh newsprint stood tied with rope. John lifted them with slow strength, while Ethan sorted the delivery slips and filled his bag. Together they moved through the city like shadows. John pushed the cart. Ethan ran ahead, dropping folded papers on stoops and lobby desks. Their work was invisible. By the time the city awoke, their ghosts had already vanished. Ethan's life existed in the spaces no one looked at. At school he sat quiet, unremarkable. His clothes hung loose, his hair often uncombed from long nights. Teachers overlooked him. Other children laughed at him, called him the paper boy, the poor kid. He kept his head down, spoke little. They never saw the notebooks hidden in his bag, pages filled not with doodles but with equations. They never knew that when they played games after school, he hunched over scraps of newsprint, copying diagrams of algorithms, building counterexamples to problems most adults could not name. The hunger for numbers was his inheritance. His mother had been the first to see it. When he was 6, she taught him fractions with orange slices, ratios with laundry loads. She had a heart condition that insurance would not cover. By the time he turned 9, she was gone. He still remembered the sterile smell of the hospital, the sound of her voice when she said, "Do not let the world tell you what you cannot know." Those words followed him into every night. They burned in him when he stared at the whiteboard on the 20th floor. The wrong sign was more than a mathematical flaw. It was a lie. And he had been raised to believe that lies must be seen for what they are. When the route ended that night, Ethan did not sleep. In their small apartment with its thin walls and unreliable heater, he spread a torn scrap of newspaper across the table. His father lay asleep on the couch, boots still near the door. Ethan drew the matrix from memory, the one he had seen on the board. With his dull pencil, he corrected the sign, sketched the feasible region of the solution space, and felt the truth settle heavy in his chest. They were building a system that would claim success while hiding failure. Investors would see neat tables and confident projections, but the foundation would be broken, invisible until the collapse came. The boy closed his eyes and imagined bridges drawn with beams reversed, airplanes built with the wrong load calculation, medicines dosed with inverted signs. He imagined the faces of men in suits smiling as they exchanged signatures on a contract worth $800 million, their confidence built upon a number that did not hold. And he imagined silence, his own silence, pressing down like a stone. For he was only a boy with a pencil and a bag of papers. Who would listen to him? He whispered again into the quiet room, "They do not know." The words trembled in the air, too fragile to reach anyone. He closed his notebook and folded the scrap of newsprint carefully, as if it were treasure. His last thought before sleep was not of school or friends, but of the matrix itself, the fragile line between truth and illusion, and of the terrible cost when the world chooses not to see the difference. Morning came not with sunlight, but with exhaustion. Ethan sat at his desk in the back corner of the classroom, his head bent over a battered notebook. The night before had stretched long, paper routes, the whiteboard in the glass tower, the trembling discovery of a broken equation, and yet here he was, fighting to keep his eyelids from closing. The teacher's voice washed over the room in a steady rhythm, reciting definitions of triangles and circles that Ethan had mastered years ago. The children around him laughed, scribbled, and whispered. Their desks shone with bright binders and untouched pencils. Ethan's supplies were second-hand, a pencil shaved down so short it barely fit in his hand, a notebook with pages torn from yesterday's newspaper glued into it. He did not mind. To him, every scrap was a space to test an idea. But to them, he was simply the paper boy. A girl in the row ahead leaned back and muttered loud enough for the room to hear, "Careful, or your desk might smell like old ink." Laughter rose around him. Ethan's cheeks warmed, but he kept his eyes on the page. His pencil traced quiet symbols, X subscript I, W subscript I, the faint outline of an objective function. The teacher, weary and pressed for time, let the laughter pass. For years, Ethan had lived inside this invisibility. He was neither the brightest student on the board, nor the troublemaker who drew attention, nor the athlete who won applause. He was the boy with frayed sleeves who walked alone in the halls, the boy who left school early to help his father push a cart of newspapers through the dark. After class, he sat by himself in the cafeteria, his lunch a plain sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Around him, conversations sparkled about new shoes, video games, and weekend trips. He listened silently. He had little to add, less to prove. Yet inside his mind, other voices lived. The voices of mathematicians whose names his classmates had never heard, Cook, Karp, Danzig, echoed through his thoughts. He repeated their problems to himself the way others repeated baseball scores. The traveling salesman problem, the knapsack dilemma, linear relaxations, words that sounded like foreign spells to the children who mocked him, but to Ethan they were as natural as breathing. At night, after delivering the last paper, Ethan often lingered by the Helios Labs tower. The building became a beacon for him. Through the glass, he sometimes caught glimpses of the whiteboard being rewritten, new numbers added, equations shifted like pieces in a puzzle. He studied every mark he could, storing them in memory. The wrong sign burned in his thoughts like a coal. It was not only that he had spotted it, it was that no one else seemed to care. Grown men in expensive suits walked past it with confidence. Engineers erased and rewrote around it, as if the flaw were invisible. Ethan knew something his father had tried to teach him. People see only what they expect. They expect a boy who delivers newspapers to know nothing about matrices. They expect investors to trust shiny reports. They expect contracts to be sound if the signatures are bold. But expectations do not change reality. And reality, Ethan knew, was merciless with mistakes. One evening, as they pushed the cart through the wind, Ethan gathered the courage to speak. "Dad," he said softly, "I saw something last night. At the labs." John Ward grunted, pushing his shoulder against the handle. "Another of those math boards you keep staring at?"
"This one was different,"
Ethan whispered. "The whole model is wrong. They wrote the constraint matrix with the sign reversed. If they keep it that way, the system will look like it's working, but it will collapse. It's like selling a bridge that can't hold weight." His father stopped, wiped sweat from his forehead, and looked down at his son. The lines of fatigue carved into his face deepened. "Ethan," he said gently, "we carry papers. We do not tell companies how to run their business. Those people, they wouldn't listen even if you were right." "But Dad," Ethan insisted, "what if it destroys everything? What if—" John's eyes softened with a mixture of pride and sadness. He rested a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Son, the world does not care about the warnings of a boy. It barely listens to men who shout from podiums. I want you to keep learning, to keep seeing what others do not. But you cannot throw yourself against walls that do not move." Ethan lowered his gaze. His father was not cruel. He was tired. The man worked 2 jobs, carried newspapers through storms, and still managed to cook dinner when he could. He spoke not from disbelief, but from survival, yet Ethan felt the flame in his chest remain lit. Silence would be easier, yes, but silence would also be betrayal. At school the next day, Ethan sat through another lecture. The teacher drew a triangle on the board, speaking of area and perimeter. Ethan turned his notebook to the back and began writing the equations he remembered from the Helios whiteboard. He tested small values, building a miniature version of the problem, searching for contradictions. The pencil shook in his hand, not from fear, but from urgency. He knew he was chasing something larger than homework, larger even than school. He was chasing the truth, hidden in symbols that billionaires trusted but had not tested. As the bell rang, a boy passing by his desk glanced down at the page. "What is that? Alien code?" he jeered, snatching at the notebook. Ethan pulled it back, but not before the boy saw the lines of numbers. "Figures," the boy laughed. "Paperboys scribbling nonsense again." The notebook was safe, but the sting of mockery lingered. Ethan pressed the book against his chest and walked home in silence. Yet as he walked, He felt his determination harden. He was invisible in the cafeteria, mocked in the classroom, dismissed by his father's weary caution. But the numbers themselves respected him. They revealed their secrets to his persistence. That evening, while his father rested, Ethan spread his papers across the table again. He redrew the matrix, the objective function, the constraints. He thought of feasible regions, of counterexamples, of the fragile nature of assumptions. His pencil scratched until his fingers cramped. He whispered to himself the way some children whisper prayers. If the sign is wrong, the feasible set shifts. If the feasible set shifts, the optimum is false. If the optimum is false, then every decision downstream is broken. He sat back and looked at his work. He was only 12, yet he understood what men in expensive offices were ignoring. Knowledge came to him like water finding cracks in stone. He had no teacher but patience, no tutor but hunger. And that hunger was growing. Night after night, as the city slept, Ethan Ward grew into his role, the invisible boy who saw what others refused to see. He did not know when or how he would speak, but he knew this: silence could not last forever. One day, the truth would demand a voice, even if that voice trembled. The wind pressed hard against the city that night, whistling through alleys and rattling loose shutters. Ethan and his father trudged along their route, bags heavy, boots scraping pavement slick with rain. The boy's shoulders burned from the weight, but his mind was elsewhere. Every step he took, every paper he dropped on a doorstep, carried the echo of the whiteboard in the glass tower. That single line of ink, that wrong sign in the constraint matrix, haunted him like a whisper he could not silence. When they returned to the apartment, his father fell into the couch, boots still laced. The exhaustion of decades clung to him, and within minutes he was asleep. Ethan moved quietly, setting his papers on the table. The apartment was dim, the single lamp flickering, but to him, the light was enough. He pulled out the scrap of newsprint on which he had sketched the whiteboard's equations. He spread it flat, smoothed the creases, and began to work. His dull pencil traced out the objective function again, minimized the cost by adjusting the variables. He knew the shape of it well. But the constraints? Those were the skeleton of the problem. Each inequality was a wall, and together they carved out the space of possible solutions. That space was called the feasible region. The mistake he had seen, the simple reversal of a sign, was no small error. It was like tilting one wall outward when it should lean inward. The region of possible solutions became distorted. What looked like an answer inside the new region would not satisfy the original reality. The algorithm would announce victory while, in truth, it had lost. Ethan whispered to himself, repeating the words he had read in an old forum post. Garbage in, garbage out. If the model's constraints were false, then, no matter how fast the computer ran, no matter how elegant the code, the result was rotten. On a sheet of scrap paper, he began to test small examples. He created a miniature version of the problem with only 3 variables. He chose numbers carefully, assigning limits and costs. Then, with deliberate hands, he reversed a single sign in the constraint. The result was startling. The algorithm's solution told him to select all 3 variables. But when he checked against the original reality, the total broke the very limits the system was meant to respect. The model had lied. Ethan sat back, his heart beating faster. This was no coincidence. What he had seen at Helios Labs was not simply a careless mistake. It was a model designed to show strength, not truth. Investors would see efficiency, stability, profitability. But in practice, the system would crumble. The thought made his chest tighten. How many men in suits were preparing to sign their names under this illusion? How much money, how many lives, would be bound to that false promise? And why had no one noticed? He remembered a phrase from an article he had once read. Mathematical optimization is the skeleton beneath modern industry. If the skeleton cracked, the body could not stand. Ethan knew now that the crack was real. He looked over at his father, sleeping heavily on the couch. His chest rose and fell in the dim light. Ethan longed to wake him, to explain everything, to prove that what he had discovered mattered. But his father's words from the night before lingered. The world does not care about the warnings of a boy. Still, Ethan could not stop. He filled page after page with examples. Each time he reversed the sign, the solution failed. Each time he corrected it, the system worked. He built counterexamples the way other children built towers from blocks. His hands shook not with fear, but with the intensity of discovery. At last he paused, staring at the mess of numbers. He realized something even darker. The way the model had been written, the wrong sign did not simply appear by accident. It made the outcome look better than it truly was. With the sign reversed, the system seemed cheaper, faster, more efficient. It was a lie that worked in favor of those selling it. It was not a flaw, it was a weapon. Ethan pressed his hands against the table, his stomach twisted. If this mistake had been intentional, then someone in that building wanted to deceive. Someone had written the formula knowing it would impress outsiders who lacked the training to see the trap. And if that was true, then the stakes were even higher. He whispered, almost in fear, "They are not just wrong. They are pretending." The room felt colder. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and stared at the paper. A boy of 12 had no power against companies worth billions, but knowledge itself gave him no rest. Once he had seen the truth, he could not unsee it. At school the next morning, his notebooks were filled not with the assigned exercises, but with his examples. During mathematics class, the teacher asked for a volunteer to solve a simple linear equation on the board. Ethan stayed silent. He could have solved it in seconds, but his mind was too far ahead, locked in the maze of constraints and objectives. He thought not of single equations, but of systems, of feasibility, of proofs and counterexamples. When the bell rang, he sat alone on the steps outside, sketching yet another problem. A group of boys passed by, laughing. One of them kicked at his bag, spilling a few crumpled pages onto the ground. "What's this?" the boy jeered. "Secret code from the newspaper?" The others laughed. Ethan quickly gathered the papers, cheeks burning, but he said nothing. They would not understand, and he had no strength to fight them. That evening he tried again to explain to his father. "Dad," he said, "the formula I told you about. It's not just a mistake. It's dangerous. They wrote it that way on purpose. It makes the system look good, but it's false. If they sell it, it will fail. People will lose everything." John looked at him, eyes heavy with fatigue. "Ethan, you are 12. These people have teams of experts. Do you think you see something none of them see?" Ethan swallowed. "Yes," he whispered. "I do." His father sighed, rubbed his temples, and pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Son, I want to believe you. I know you're smart. Smarter than anyone I've ever known. But the world—" He trailed off. His voice was softer now, touched with sorrow. "The world doesn't listen to paper boys." Ethan turned away, staring at the notebook on the table. His father's words stung, but they did not extinguish the fire. The boy felt the truth inside him too strongly. He could not remain silent forever. Late into the night, long after his father had drifted into sleep, Ethan wrote again. His counterexamples grew sharper. He outlined in clear steps how the reversed sign destroyed feasibility. He practiced explaining it in plain words. as if speaking to someone who had never seen a matrix before. He rehearsed the logic again and again, preparing for a moment that might never come. When at last he lay down, he whispered into the dark, "They will have to hear me." The dangerous clue was no longer just a detail on a whiteboard. It had become the center of his world, a truth too heavy to ignore, a burden too large for a child's shoulders, and yet one he would not set down. The night air smelled of damp asphalt and ink-stained newsprint. Ethan and his father moved through the city as they always did, one pushing the heavy cart, the other darting from door to door, leaving folded newspapers like secret messages that vanished before dawn. To anyone watching, they were just two shadows against the empty streets. But inside Ethan's mind, the storm raged louder with every step. The wrong sign in the constraint matrix no longer felt like an academic puzzle. It had become a warning, a signal of betrayal, a fire he could not smother. When the last bundle was delivered and they climbed the creaking stairs back to their apartment, Ethan could no longer hold the weight inside. His father dropped onto the couch, boots still on his feet, rubbing the stiffness from his hands. The room smelled faintly of the weak stew they had eaten before leaving, of old paper and worn fabric. Ethan spread his notebook open on the kitchen table, the pages filled with his cramped handwriting and shaky diagrams. His pencil trembled slightly as he pointed to the sketch of the matrix. "Dad," he began, his voice thin but urgent, "I need you to listen. This isn't just some math problem. It's real. At Helios Labs, they wrote the formula wrong. See this line here? The sign is reversed. Because of that, the computer will say it found the best answer, but it will be lying. The answer won't even follow the rules they set. If they use this system, it will collapse. They're planning to sell it for hundreds of millions, but it's broken." His father looked at him, eyes heavy from exhaustion. He loved his son, but the words spilling from Ethan's lips sounded too large, too foreign, too far from the world he knew. He had spent his life carrying bundles of paper, counting coins, fighting the slow ache of survival. A reversed sign in a matrix was as distant to him as the stars. "Ethan," he said softly, "we deliver newspapers. That's our job. What happens in those glass towers? It isn't ours to fix." Ethan's chest tightened. "But Dad, it's wrong. They're lying. Or maybe they don't even see it. Either way, people are going to lose everything. I proved it. Look." He pushed the notebook closer, pointing at his counterexample. "Here. The algorithm says this solution is optimal, but if you check against the real limits, it fails. The whole thing fails." John Ward rubbed his face with both hands, the calluses rough against tired skin. He wanted to believe his son. He wanted to see what Ethan saw in those numbers, but the boy was 12. And the world, in John's experience, had no place for the warnings of a 12-year-old. "Son," he said, voice thick with weariness, "I know you're smart. Smarter than anyone I've ever met. But this isn't our fight. Those men up there, they wouldn't listen to me. They wouldn't listen to you. You'll only hurt yourself trying." The words fell heavy between them. Ethan's hands curled into fists. His throat burned, but no tears came. He stared at his father's worn face, at the lines carved deep by years of labor, and felt the sting of truth. His father was not dismissing him out of cruelty. He was protecting him, teaching him the hard lesson of survival. Still, the fire inside Ethan refused to dim. "I can't just stay quiet," he whispered. "If I know the truth, and I do nothing, then I'm part of the lie." John looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and placed a rough hand on his son's shoulder. His touch was heavy, grounding. "Ethan, your mother. She always believed you would see more than the rest of us, and maybe you do. But promise me this. Don't let it destroy you. Sometimes silence keeps you alive. The boy lowered his head, unable to answer. The ache in his chest was sharper now, the weight of both knowledge and helplessness pressing down. He closed the notebook slowly, as if shutting the pages might trap the truth inside. But he knew it would not. Once seen, the flaw could not be unseen. That night, as his father drifted into sleep on the couch, Ethan sat in the darkened kitchen, staring at the notebook. The pages seemed to glow in the dim light, the equations alive with urgency. He felt the pull of two worlds. In one, he was just a paper boy, invisible, mocked, dismissed. In the other, he was the only one who could see the flaw that threatened to topple a fortune. The clock ticked past midnight. The boy's eyes burned from lack of rest, but he did not move. He whispered to the silence, as though speaking to his mother's memory. "What good is knowing if no one believes me?" The question hung unanswered, but even as despair pressed against him, a flicker of determination remained. He had studied enough mathematics to know that proof was stronger than opinion. A father's doubt, a company's arrogance, a crowd's laughter, none of these could erase a contradiction once it was shown. He did not know when or how, but one day he would show them. At school the next morning, he moved through the hallways like a ghost. His classmates jostled past him, laughing, trading jokes. Ethan walked alone, the notebook clutched to his chest. During lessons, he filled the margins with more examples, sharpening his counter-arguments, practicing how to explain them simply. He imagined himself standing before men in suits, his voice shaking, but his reasoning unbroken. The teacher called on him once, asking for the solution to a geometry problem. Ethan answered quietly, correctly, but his mind was elsewhere. He was already rehearsing lines he might never speak, arguments he might never be allowed to give. That evening, he returned again to the Helios Tower with his father. The cart rattled over uneven pavement, the bag on his shoulder heavy with folded papers. As they entered the lobby, Ethan's eyes darted upward. The 20th floor was lit once more. Behind the glass wall of the conference room, he caught a glimpse of the same whiteboard. New notes had been added, more symbols crowding the surface, but the wrong sign remained. The flaw endured, untouched, like a splinter buried in the flesh of the model. He felt his breath quicken. For a moment he considered leaving the cart, running upstairs, bursting into the room to tell them. But his father's voice echoed in his ears. The world does not listen to paper boys. The fire inside him clashed with the weight of those words, and he stood frozen in the lobby, caught between the courage of truth and the despair of invisibility. When they left the tower and the night swallowed them again, Ethan looked back one last time. The golden rectangle of light on the 20th floor glowed against the darkness. It was both a promise and a threat. He knew now, with absolute certainty, that the path ahead would not let him rest. The hopeless conversation with his father had left him shaken, but not broken. He was 12 years old, poor, unseen, mocked. Yet he carried a truth that men worth billions had missed or ignored. The question that haunted him was no longer whether he was right. He knew he was. The question was how long he could bear the silence and how far he would go to be heard. The city dawned in gray silence. Streets glistened from the night's rain, their reflections broken by passing tires. Ethan walked beside his father, the canvas bag heavy against his side. The routine was the same as always. Bundle after bundle, doorway after doorway, their invisible ritual carried out before most of the world had stirred from sleep. Yet beneath the rhythm, Ethan's chest throbbed with something different. For days he had wrestled with silence. He had rehearsed proofs in his notebook, drawn counterexamples until his hands cramped, whispered arguments into the dark as if speaking to an audience that never appeared. His father's words echoed. The world does not listen to paper boys. But the fire refused to die. And this morning, destiny conspired with chance. Their route intersected with Helios Labs at the very hour the company prepared for a monumental signing. Inside, executives and investors gathered, polished shoes clicking against polished floors, voices low and confident, pens ready to inscribe history onto contracts. Ethan did not know the details, but he felt the weight of the moment in the air. Even from the lobby, he could sense it. Anticipation hung like static before a storm. He followed his father inside, carrying the morning stack. The marble floor reflected the lights above, the vast space nearly silent except for the echo of footsteps. His father moved toward the delivery box, but Ethan's eyes were drawn upward, to the elevator doors that opened and closed, ferrying men in dark suits toward the 20th floor. He hesitated, the bag still heavy in his arms. The same golden rectangle of light burned high above. The boardroom waited. John noticed his son's pause. "Come on, Ethan," he said, his voice edged with fatigue. "We've got more stops before sunrise." But Ethan did not move. His heart pounded in his chest, so loud he thought it might betray him. He felt as though he stood at the edge of a chasm, one step away from being swallowed by silence forever. One step away from speaking the truth he carried. His throat was dry, his palms slick with sweat. He had never walked into any room with such men. He had never spoken in front of strangers who commanded millions. And yet, the fire pushed him forward. "I need to go," he whispered. "What?" His father frowned. "I need to tell them," Ethan said, his voice trembling but unshaken. John shook his head. "Ethan, no. Don't embarrass yourself. These people won't understand. They won't even listen." But the boy had already shifted the bag to his shoulder, clutching a folded newspaper in one hand like a shield. His legs carried him toward the elevator before he had time to think. He heard his father call after him, but the sound blurred. The elevator doors closed, sealing his choice. The ride up was silent, the numbers blinking above the door. 10, 11, 12. With each floor, his heart hammered harder. He clutched the folded paper so tightly it crumpled. He thought of his mother's words, "Do not let the world tell you what you cannot know," and he held them like a prayer. When the doors opened, he stepped into a world that did not belong to him. The 20th floor gleamed with glass and steel. The air smelled faintly of cologne and coffee. Voices murmured behind the boardroom doors, deep and confident, punctuated by laughter. Through the frosted glass, he saw silhouettes around a long table. He pushed the door open. For a heartbeat, the room froze. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Men in tailored suits, women in sharp dresses, a row of investors with open folders, a cluster of engineers with laptops glowing before them. At the head of the table sat a man with silver hair and an expression of command. Beside him, a younger executive adjusted his tie. And there, behind them, loomed the whiteboard. Equations spread across its surface in red and black, the same lattice of symbols that had haunted Ethan's nights. The wrong sign still burned like a wound in the center of it all. The silence broke into laughter. "Who let the delivery boy in?" One man chuckled. Another leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Careful, gentlemen. We may have an unexpected auditor." A lawyer at the far end of the table tilted his head, amused. "Son, do you even know what this is? We're discussing optimization models. That's not exactly child's play." Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. His fingers shook as he unfolded the crumpled newspaper, holding it like evidence. His voice came out small but steady. "There's a mistake," he said. "In your constraint matrix, the sign is reversed. The model won't hold. For a moment, silence returned, heavier than before. Then came a wave of laughter, sharper this time. "A constraint matrix?" one man mocked. "That's adorable." Another leaned forward, smiling like a man entertaining a joke. "Tell me, son, do you know the difference between an invertible matrix and a singular one?" The lawyer joined in, smirking. "Or perhaps you can explain feasibility conditions for linear programming? Do you know what those words mean?" The laughter grew. Ethan's cheeks burned. His heart thudded painfully, but his hand reached for the table. There, amid cups of coffee and glossy contracts, lay a napkin. He picked it up, took the pencil from behind his ear, and with a trembling hand began to write. He drew the small example he had built at his kitchen table. 3 variables, a simple cost function, constraints carefully chosen. He reversed one sign and showed the result. Then he checked it against the original. The numbers proved his point. The algorithm's solution broke the rules. He placed the napkin on the table, his small hand resting on it. "This is what your model will do," he said quietly. "It looks right. But it isn't. It's false." The room fell silent. For the first time, no one laughed. The executives glanced at each other. The engineers frowned, leaning closer to the napkin. The silver-haired man at the head of the table narrowed his eyes, but then, with a dismissive wave, one of the investors scoffed. "Coincidence. A parlor trick. We don't build billion-dollar contracts on the scribbles of a paperboy." Relief flickered across the room, as if the spell had broken. Laughter returned, though weaker now, uncertain. Ethan stood frozen, his heart sinking. He had spoken. He had shown them. And still they dismissed him. His father's words echoed in his ears. The world does not listen to paperboys. But deep inside, beneath the shame and fear, a spark remained. He had not been wrong. He knew it. The contradiction was real. One day, whether they believed him or not, the truth would reveal itself. For now he stood in the boardroom, invisible yet again, clutching the folded newspaper in his trembling hands. The laughter rose like a wave, rolling from one end of the long table to the other. It was not cruel in the way of school children mocking a classmate, but colder, sharper, the kind of laughter grown men use to dismiss what they do not fear. The polished wood of the table gleamed under the light, reflecting the polished confidence of those who sat around it. Ethan stood at its edge, small and frayed, the crumpled newspaper still in his hand, the napkin with his scribbled proof resting on the table like a fragile seed in a storm. "Gentlemen," one of the investors said, leaning back in his chair, "this is charming. Truly. A boy brings us our morning news and, along with it, a free math lesson." The others chuckled. A lawyer with a narrow smile tapped his pen against the table. "Tell me, son, have you studied linear algebra? Do you know what it means for a matrix to be singular? Or perhaps you've mastered convex optimization in your spare time between deliveries?" His voice dripped with condescension, each word a needle. Ethan said nothing. His hands trembled, but he kept them steady against the table's edge. He could feel the warmth of his own blood rushing in his ears. The napkin sat between them all, numbers plain and quiet, more honest than the laughter surrounding it. Another voice joined in, light and mocking. "Maybe he learned all this from YouTube videos." That explains the confidence. The silver-haired man at the head of the table, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was measured, calm, but edged with impatience. "This is not the time, nor the place for interruptions. Young man, we are in the middle of finalizing an acquisition worth hundreds of millions. Do you understand what that means? This is not a school project. This is business. Real business." Ethan swallowed. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet every ear in the room caught it. If you sign with the model as it is, the business will fail. For a moment, silence. The words seemed too heavy for such a small voice, too sharp for such a thin frame. But then the room burst again with laughter, some forced, some uneasy. "Do you hear this?" an executive said, shaking his head. "A paper boy prophesying the end of our system." Ethan felt his throat tighten, but he did not retreat. He looked at the napkin again, the little example he had written with trembling hands. He remembered the nights at the kitchen table, the hours spent testing and retesting, the certainty he had carried into this very room. He could not back down, not now, not when the truth sat plain before them. With sudden courage, he picked up the pencil again. His hand still shook, but his movements were precise. On the back of the newspaper, he drew another example, this one even simpler, stripped to bare essentials. 2 variables, 1 constraint. He showed what happened when the sign was correct. The solution matched the reality. Then he reversed it, as the Helios model had done. The solution looked perfect on paper but shattered against the real condition. He slid the newspaper forward, the pencil rolling after it. His voice broke the silence. "It isn't a trick. It's proof. 1 wrong sign and the model lies. It says what you want to hear. But reality doesn't care what you want." The laughter faded. Some leaned closer, frowning. The engineers at the far end of the table exchanged looks, uncertain. One of them reached for the newspaper, scanning the boy's handwriting. His brow furrowed. But before he could speak, the lawyer cut in sharply. "Enough! We do not have time for riddles from children. This meeting is about signatures, not scribbles." Ethan's chest burned. He wanted to shout, to argue, to plead. Instead, he stood still, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He looked at each face, searching for even one sign of belief. For a moment his eyes met those of a man in a gray suit, older, his glasses perched low on his nose. Unlike the others, he did not laugh. He only stared at the boy, expression unreadable, as though weighing something invisible. But the moment passed. The silver-haired leader raised his hand, signaling for the noise to quiet. "Young man," he said firmly, "you are brave to walk into this room. But bravery is not enough. We have advisors, experts, professors who have reviewed this model. They have not raised the alarm you claim to raise. Do you understand?" Ethan lowered his gaze. His father's words returned. The world does not listen to paper boys. Around him, the polished men and women turned back to their folders, their laptops, their contracts. Conversation resumed, laughter soft but dismissive. The boy was already forgotten. He felt the sting of tears but forced them back. His mother's voice whispered in his memory, "Do not let the world tell you what you cannot know." He stood straighter, though his body trembled. He reached for the napkin and the newspaper, sliding them back toward himself, his proof unclaimed, his truth unwanted. As he turned to leave, a quiet voice came from the far end of the table. It was the man in the gray suit, the one with glasses. "Numbers do not laugh," he said softly, almost to himself. But the words hung in the air, sharp enough to be heard. Ethan glanced back, but no one else seemed to notice. The meeting carried on, the shuffle of papers and clink of pens drowning the silence. He walked out of the boardroom, his small figure swallowed by the vast corridor, the folded newspaper pressed tight against his chest. Behind him, the laughter still echoed. Ahead of him stretched only uncertainty, but inside, the fire still burned. He had spoken, he had shown them, and though they mocked him, he knew the truth would not stay buried forever. In the elevator ride down, his reflection in the polished metal looked pale and small, his jacket too thin, his eyes too old for 12 years. He thought of his father waiting in the lobby, perhaps angry, perhaps worried. He thought of the wrong sign still etched on the whiteboard, glowing red like a wound. And he thought of the silence he had broken, fragile but unshakable. They could laugh. They could dismiss. But numbers did not bend to laughter. Equations did not bow to pride. And one day, when the model failed, they would remember the boy with the newspaper who tried to warn them. The boardroom air was heavy with dismissal. The laughter had faded, replaced by the rustle of contracts and the quiet hum of laptops. For the men and women seated at the table, the interruption was over. A paper boy had wandered in, muttered about equations, and left behind nothing but a napkin of scribbles. The acquisition would proceed, signatures flowing like ink across the surface of history. But Ethan did not leave. He stood just inside the door, the crumpled newspaper pressed against his chest, the pencil still warm in his fingers. His body trembled, but his feet refused to move. The sound of pens clicking open seemed to echo like thunder in his ears. He thought of his father waiting in the lobby, of the words he would hear when this was over. Embarrassment, frustration, a plea to keep quiet. He thought of the men at the table, their polished voices rising above his, confident and absolute. And yet, louder than all of them, he thought of the equation. The wrong sign still burned in his mind like fire. Numbers did not lie, and numbers did not forgive. He took a deep breath and stepped forward again. His voice was small but carried in the hush. "Please," he said, "just give me one more piece of paper." The silver-haired man at the head of the table looked up, irritation flickering across his features. But before he could refuse, the older man with glasses, the one who had spoken quietly before, slid a sheet toward the boy. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weight in his gaze. Ethan took the paper with trembling hands. He set it flat on the table, pressed his pencil down, and began to work. He did not try to explain definitions. He did not argue about invertible matrices or feasibility regions. Instead, he built something simple, something undeniable. A counterexample. He drew a model with 3 variables, each representing a resource. He gave them small costs, numbers anyone could follow. Then he set a constraint. The total could not exceed a certain limit. With the sign correct, the system produced a clean solution, logical and clear. But when he flipped the sign, just as he had seen on their whiteboard, the system returned a solution that looked perfect, yet broke the rule. His pencil scratched quickly, the marks small and precise. He circled the contradiction, then placed the pencil down. His voice shook, but it carried. "This is what will happen. Your model will say it is optimal, but it will break the constraint. And when it breaks, the whole system fails, not in years, not in theory, in months." The room was silent. No one laughed. The engineers leaned forward. One of them adjusted his glasses and traced the boy's work with his finger. His lips moved silently, recalculating. A frown deepened. Another engineer whispered to a colleague, both of them hunched over the page like men reading a warning carved into stone. The lawyer who had mocked him earlier cleared his throat, ready to dismiss it again, but his voice faltered under the weight of the silence. He shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone. The silver-haired leader tapped the table lightly. "Explain," he said to his engineers. One of them looked up, hesitant. The boy may be correct. With the sign reversed, the feasible set shifts. It looks valid, but under certain inputs—" He stopped, his voice low. "It collapses." The air in the room changed. Laughter had vanished. The confidence cracked. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. Contracts that had seemed inevitable now sat still, their authority fragile. Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly. He felt both smaller than ever and larger than he had ever been. For a moment, the world did not mock him. For a moment, it listened. The silver-haired man's eyes narrowed, studying him. "And how," he asked slowly, "does a boy carrying newspapers know what my engineers did not?" Ethan lowered his gaze. "Because I couldn't stop looking," he whispered. "Because when I see numbers, I see their shadows too. I don't know all the names you use. I just know when something doesn't hold." No one spoke. The hum of the city below seemed to press against the glass walls. At last, the man with glasses at the far end of the table leaned back, folding his arms. His voice was quiet, steady. "He's right," he said. "This is not coincidence. It's a flaw. A fatal one." The words struck the room like a bell. Investors shifted in their chairs. A woman at the table closed her folder with a sharp snap. Another reached for her phone, her brow furrowed. The silver-haired leader exhaled, long and heavy, his gaze never leaving Ethan. The boy stood still, trembling, his hands smudged with pencil lead. He had not shouted. He had not demanded. He had simply shown the truth. And the truth, once revealed, could not be dismissed. He thought of his father's words, of the hopeless conversation in their small kitchen. The world does not listen to paper boys, and yet here, in this glass tower, in the silence after his proof, he felt for the first time that perhaps it could. The meeting did not resume its laughter. The signatures did not fall as easily as before. The room had shifted, its certainty broken by the hand of a 12-year-old boy who delivered newspapers at dawn. And though he was still small, still poor, still unseen in so many ways, Ethan Ward knew one thing with absolute clarity. The numbers had spoken through him, and the numbers would not be forgotten. The boardroom no longer felt like marble and glass. It felt like a place where air had thickened, where silence pressed against the walls, where certainty cracked. The boy stood small at the far edge of the long table, the pencil still smudging his fingers, the counterexample drawn in shaky lines on paper that was never meant to carry the weight of billions. And yet, it did. The silver-haired leader broke the silence first. His voice was sharp, though lower now, stripped of the laughter that had filled the room minutes earlier. "If this is true," he said, gesturing toward the boy's proof, "then this entire model is compromised. 6 months. That's how long the system will hold before it breaks, if not sooner." One of the engineers nodded reluctantly, his face pale. "That's consistent. If the constraints are wrong, the algorithm projects stability until it collides with reality. When that happens, the losses would cascade. Supply mismatches, cost overruns, empty promises of optimization. It wouldn't be a matter of if, but when." The investors stirred uneasily, their confidence unraveling. A woman with steel-gray hair closed her folder with a snap. "We were prepared to commit $800 million, she said coldly. "And you are telling me it rests on a flawed equation?" Murmurs rose, low and tense. Contracts that moments before seemed unstoppable now looked fragile, their ink not yet dry but already in doubt. The polished certainty of Helios Labs had been cracked open by a boy who smelled faintly of newspaper ink. Ethan's chest tightened. He had not come here to destroy. He had come because silence was heavier than words. Now the truth had slipped into the open, and the room bent around it. The silver-haired leader turned his gaze back to him. "Do you understand what you've done, boy? You've walked into a room of people who command fortunes, who steer the future of technology, and you've told them they are wrong." Ethan lowered his eyes, but his voice, though quiet, was steady. "I didn't tell you." "The numbers did." A ripple passed through the room. Some faces tightened with anger, others with unease. The man in the gray suit, The one who had quietly defended him before leaned forward, his voice calm. The child is right. Mathematics does not care about pride. A reversed sign is not opinion. It is truth. Ignore it, and the system collapses. One of the investors rose abruptly, gathering her papers. This changes everything. We will not sign until a full audit is conducted. If what the boy says is true, this deal is already poisoned. Another investor followed, shaking his head, muttering about liability. Soon half the chairs were empty, the momentum of the deal broken, the tide turned. The silver-haired leader watched them go, his jaw tight. He knew the deal was slipping from his hands. The lawyer who had mocked Ethan earlier spoke up, his tone brittle. This is absurd. We cannot derail a transaction of this magnitude on the word of a child. The man in the gray suit cut him off, his voice sharp for the first time. Not the word of a child. The proof of a contradiction. If you cannot understand the difference, you should not be in this room. Silence again. Heavy. Unyielding. Ethan stood trembling, his knees weak. He wanted to sit, to vanish, to be back in the safety of his kitchen with only his notebook and the soft hum of his father's breath in the next room. But he also felt something new, something that steadied him even as fear gnawed at his bones. He had been heard. For the first time in his life, not mocked, not dismissed, heard. The silver-haired leader finally spoke, his voice controlled but cold. Boy, you may have saved these investors from disaster. But do not think this makes you a hero. You have embarrassed my company. You have cost us a deal that has taken years to build. There will be consequences. Ethan's throat tightened, but he said nothing. He knew his father would be waiting in the lobby, worried sick, ready to scold him for daring to speak. He knew the men in this room might never forgive him. But deep down he also knew the numbers would vindicate him. They always did. As he turned to leave, the man in the gray suit called after him. What is your name? Ethan paused at the door. His voice was soft. Ethan Ward. The man nodded once, as though committing it to memory. Do not forget today, Ethan. Truth is lonely, but it is also eternal. The boy carried those words with him as he walked out, the echo of them warming him even as the cold glares of the others followed. In the lobby, his father stood tense, arms crossed, face lined with worry and anger. What were you thinking? John hissed as soon as Ethan appeared. You embarrassed yourself in front of people who could crush us with a glance. Ethan met his eyes, trembling but unbroken. Dad, I had to. If I stayed quiet, they would have signed, and it would all fall apart. John's mouth opened, ready to argue, but something in the boy's gaze stopped him. The fire in his son's eyes was not defiance, it was conviction. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, John exhaled and shook his head. God help me, Ethan. You are your mother's child. They left the tower together, the city around them just beginning to wake. The streets buzzed faintly with early traffic, the first rays of dawn touching glass and steel. Ethan carried nothing but his crumpled notebook and a pencil worn down to its stub, yet his shoulders felt lighter. He had not destroyed the model. He had not humiliated men in suits for pleasure. He had only spoken what was true. Behind him, in the 20th floor boardroom, the future of Helios Labs shifted. The investors who remained were shaken. The acquisition was no longer inevitable. A single flaw, a single sign reversed, had toppled the illusion. And though he was still only 12, still a boy in a worn jacket, Ethan Ward had changed the course of a billion-dollar deal. The week after the boardroom incident stretched like an eternity. Ethan returned to the night routes with his father, the canvas bag once again biting into his shoulders, the streets echoing with the familiar clatter of wheels on pavement. Outwardly, nothing had changed. He was still the boy with frayed sleeves, the boy who handed folded papers through lobby doors. Yet beneath the surface, the world had shifted. Somewhere, in offices higher than he had ever imagined entering, people were speaking his name. The newspapers he delivered carried no hint of it at first. Headlines still screamed about politics, markets, and storms. But one gray morning, as he slid the folded bundle into a brass slot, his eyes caught a smaller column on the front page. Acquisition halted pending model audit. The words burned into him. It did not mention him by name, but he knew. The silence he had broken had already begun to echo. At school, he carried the secret inside him. No one noticed. His classmates still laughed at his hand-me-down shoes, still jeered when he stumbled over words in English class. He still sat alone at lunch, scribbling in his notebook. But this time, the scribbles were not just numbers. They were rehearsals. He wrote again and again how he would explain it to men who demanded precision. He practiced the words aloud in whispers. Feasible region, NP hard, linear constraint, counterexample. He simplified each phrase until it sounded like something his father could understand, because he knew that clarity, not jargon, was his only shield. Then, one night, the call came. His father answered the phone, his brow furrowed, his eyes flicking toward Ethan. They want to see you, John said slowly. A panel. Experts. They want you to explain what you showed them. Ethan's heart pounded. He felt his breath catch, half in terror, half in awe. The truth was no longer hiding in his notebook. It was stepping into the light. The following day, he walked once more through the glass doors of Helios Labs. This time he was not carrying newspapers. His jacket was still frayed, his shoes still scuffed, but he clutched a small folder of carefully written notes. His father walked beside him, nervous, uncertain, but unwilling to let his son face the room alone. The panel waited in a broad room of glass and steel. A long table stretched down the center, surrounded by men and women with folders, laptops, and sharp eyes. Some were professors flown in from universities he had only ever read about. Others were auditors, mathematicians trained to pick apart the foundations of models. At the head of the table sat the silver-haired leader, his face unreadable, and beside him the man in the gray suit, his gaze steady. Ethan took a seat at the far end, the folder trembling in his hands. He looked so small in the vast room, but when he opened the folder, his hands steadied. "Begin," the silver-haired man said curtly. Ethan drew a deep breath. He spoke slowly, carefully, as though explaining to his father. Optimization is about finding the best solution within limits. The limits are called constraints. They are written in a matrix. Each row says what is allowed and what is not. He paused, glancing at the faces watching him. Some seemed bored, others skeptical, but a few leaned forward. If even one sign in the matrix is wrong, the system changes its shape. It thinks the limits are somewhere else. The algorithm may say, "This is the best solution," but it is only best inside the wrong shape. In reality, it breaks the rule. He turned a page and showed his counterexample, drawn neatly this time, numbers aligned. Here is proof. With the sign correct, the solution works. With the sign wrong, the solution fails. The failure is invisible until it meets reality. The room was quiet. A professor with gray hair adjusted her glasses, scanning the paper. She whispered something to her neighbor. Another tapped quickly on a laptop, inputting the boy's numbers. After a few moments, the screen confirmed it. The model collapsed under the wrong sign. Ethan continued, his voice trembling but unbroken. The model on your whiteboard had the sign wrong. It will pretend to be strong, but it is not. If the acquisition had been signed, the system would have failed in months. The cost would not just be money. It would be jobs, futures, trust. He lowered his pencil. His folder was nearly empty now. He had spoken everything he had prepared. All that remained was silence. The professors murmured, trading papers, recalculating. One finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. He is correct. The flaw is real. The model, as it stands, is invalid. The words rippled across the table. Auditors nodded reluctantly. Investors scribbled furious notes. The silver-haired leader's face hardened, but even he did not speak against it. The truth had been confirmed. Ethan sat very still, his hands folded tightly together. He felt both exhausted and lighter than air. He had stood before them, had spoken, and the truth had held. The man in the gray suit leaned forward, his voice carrying across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, let us be clear. A 12-year-old boy walked in with nothing but a pencil and saw what we missed. We should not be ashamed of him. We should be ashamed of ourselves. The words landed heavily. Ethan's face flushed. He lowered his eyes, but inside his mother's voice echoed. Do not let the world tell you what you cannot know. By evening, the news spread. Headlines began to appear, first on small sites, then larger. Paperboy halts billion-dollar deal. Photos circulated of the boy in his worn jacket, standing shyly at the edge of the glass tower, a folded newspaper in his hand. Commentators marveled at how a child could see what experts had overlooked. Some mocked, some doubted, but the story spread all the same. In the apartment that night, John Ward set down the paper and looked at his son with eyes shining not just with pride, but with disbelief. You did it, he said softly. You really did it. Ethan, exhausted, leaned his head against the back of the couch. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who had spoken because silence had been too heavy. Yet deep inside, warmth spread. For the first time, the world had listened. And though he was still invisible in the halls of his school, still mocked for his clothes, still the boy who delivered papers at dawn, Ethan Ward had placed a mark in the world of men who thought themselves untouchable. He had shown that truth was not measured in age or wealth or the shine of a suit. Truth was measured in proof, and proof, once given, could not be undone. 1 year later, the tower of Helios Labs still stood against the skyline, its glass gleaming in the morning sun. But something within it had changed. Deals were no longer signed without scrutiny. Contracts no longer carried equations no one dared to question. Independent audits became law in the company's halls, not because executives suddenly discovered humility, but because one night, a boy with a newspaper bag had refused to be silent. Ethan Ward was no longer simply a shadow on the streets. He was still small, still carried the traces of the boy who ran through alleys before dawn. But the world now spoke his name with a strange mixture of wonder and disbelief. The paper boy who stopped a billion-dollar lie, one headline had called him. Another, more poetic. The child who proved numbers cannot be bought. At school, some of the laughter stopped. Teachers who had once looked past him now paused, their eyes softer, though still unsure of how to reach him. His classmates whispered, but now their whispers carried awe. Yet Ethan did not bask in it. He remained quiet, still sitting in the back with his notebooks, still sketching out equations in the margins. The attention did not change who he was. What changed was that, for the first time, he believed he had a right to be heard. Helios Labs, pressed by the investors who had nearly lost everything, announced the creation of a foundation in his name, the Ethan Ward Foundation for Mathematical Integrity. Its purpose was simple but profound: to provide scholarships for children who loved numbers but had no means to pursue them, and to fund independent reviews of mathematical models before they were unleashed upon the world. On the day of the announcement, Ethan stood on a small stage, his jacket still too big, the microphone taller than he was. Reporters filled the hall, cameras clicking like distant thunder. He looked out, not at the suits or the flashbulbs, but at the rows of children who had been invited from schools like his. Children in second-hand clothes, children with shy eyes, children who might otherwise have been invisible. He took a breath. His voice was quiet, but it carried. People thought I was just the boy who brought their newspapers. They looked at me and saw the jacket with holes, the shoes too small, the silence. They never thought I could see numbers the way I do. But numbers don't belong to the rich. Equations don't care about who wears the suit or who wears the threadbare coat. A wrong formula will betray anyone who trusts it. He paused, his eyes shining. What matters is not who you are, but whether you are willing to see the truth. And anyone, any child can see the truth if they are given the chance to learn. There was a stillness in the hall as his words settled. Then came the applause, not roaring or triumphant, but steady, rising like warmth in a winter room. That evening, when the cameras were gone, Ethan walked home with his father. The air smelled of spring, the streets alive with the hum of traffic. John Ward looked at his son, pride flickering in his tired eyes. "Your mother would have cried today," he said softly. "Not from sorrow, from joy. You've turned our life into something I never thought possible." Ethan smiled faintly. "It wasn't me, Dad. It was the numbers." John shook his head, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "No, Ethan. It was you. Numbers don't speak unless someone gives them a voice." In the months that followed, change spread quietly. Corporations began to include independent mathematical audits in their contracts. Universities debated how they had allowed a boy to see what experts had overlooked. And in small towns across the country, children with little more than pencils and determination applied to the foundation, their eyes bright with the hunger to learn. Ethan often returned to the apartment table where it had begun, where scraps of newspaper had once served as his chalkboard. He still worked late into the night, still chased problems larger than himself, still whispered equations as though they were prayers. But now he did so with a sense of belonging. He was no longer invisible. And yet, even as his world grew larger, he carried the humility of the boy who had once stood in a boardroom, trembling under laughter. He remembered the silence before the proof, the disbelief, the sting of ridicule. Those memories kept him gentle, kept him from arrogance, kept him close to the truth that had guided him all along. Numbers did not bend for wealth, and truth did not need permission. One spring afternoon, Ethan visited his mother's grave. The grass was green around the headstone, the air alive with birdsong. He knelt, resting a folded newspaper on the stone, as he had done every week since she had passed. This time, though, he also placed something else, a small notebook, its cover worn, its pages filled with the counterexamples that had changed everything. "I did what you asked, Mom," he whispered. "I didn't let the world tell me what I couldn't know." His voice trembled, but his eyes shone with quiet peace. The wind carried the scent of blossoms across the cemetery. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a warmth that reached deeper than pride, deeper than recognition. It was healing. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked back toward the life that waited for him, the life of a boy who had seen the truth and spoken it, no matter the cost. In time, people would forget the headlines. They would forget the exact sum of the halted deal, the names of the investors, the laughter in the boardroom. But what remained What endured was a change in the way the world approached its own certainty. And behind it all was the memory of a boy with a frayed jacket and a bag of newspapers who had once looked at a whiteboard full of equations and dared to say, "This is wrong." That was his legacy. Not fame, not riches, not power. His legacy was the quiet assurance that truth, no matter how small the voice that carried it, could change everything. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please consider subscribing so we can share more stories together.